Episode 54 of Strange Brow Radio. Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Tobe Johnson. You know the drill. Today's guest is Melissa Martell of the Secret Door podcast, and we're going to be talking about psychic or paranormal backlash. Yeah, it's called that for a reason, and Melissa's going to talk to us about her experiences with that and her awesome podcast, The Secret Door. Also, thank you to our sponsor, Feral by Aaron at Etsy.com. That's ERYN. Keep the orders coming and you keep the pirate ship afloating. I also want to thank you for coming to Manresa Castle for our bi-monthly live events at manresacastle.com. Check it out. Stay the night. Haunted Castle in Port Townsend. All right, we'll be right back with our guests, Melissa Martell. But first, some news. All right, thanks again for joining us. And before we get to our guest, I wanted to mention more about Manresa Castle. Now, our bi-monthly events are in Port Townsend, Washington, as I've mentioned before, in this historic, beautiful hotel that one time was Mr. Eisenbeiss's gift to his wife, who is the originator, the builder, the architect, the mind behind Manresa Castle, built in the late 1800s. And some say his ghost still haunts the buildings there. We definitely had our own experiences in and outside of the castle, mainly in the castle. But of course, when we do a live broadcast out of the castle, or a podcast that we call Podcastle Live, it is done generally during the first of every other month. So January 4th, we had our first 2020 Podcastle Live with Olympic Peninsula Paranormal Society guru Mary Bethune. And some really interesting stuff happened on the SLS camera that I mentioned before. And if you're a member of Patreon, you can catch in-depth probe into this SLS camera footage that we got. And if you're interested in what an SLS camera is, I was too. And just listen to the podcast previous and we talk all about it. However, in March, on March 7th, Saturday, March 7th, from 6 to 9 or 10 at night at the Manresa Castle again will be our next broadcast at the Podcastle Live. And we are excited to announce that we have our guest lined up and locked and loaded. And it's your chance to come and learn about the elongated skulls with Marcia K. Moore from CMR Studios and Ancient Aliens. It is an amazing opportunity to get her to come and share her experiences with a live crowd. And I don't know that she's done too much public speaking on the elongated skulls. She's kind of been behind the scenes working those angles. But nonetheless, she's going to be up there with me for 2.5 or 3 hours. So we'll see what all she will bring with her, because she's done quite a bit of work as it relates to the actual bones of these mysterious elongated skulls that are mainly from Peru, but not strictly from Peru. And how this links up to the supernatural is, well, all of the strange elements behind these skulls. They don't look quite human. And so we have a lot to talk about. So Marcia K. Moore, our guest, presented at Podcastle Live, March 7th, 2020, in Port Townsend, Washington. And I hope to see you all show up for that. And the other interesting part about Manresa Castle is it's a free event. And so for you to show up, especially if you're in the Pacific Northwest, if you'd like to stay the night there, you can book a room now for the 6th or 7th of March. And I say stay on the second floor. And that seems to be one of the most active areas. And then, of course, there's the turret room, which is, if you go onto the website and take a look at Manresa Castle, you'll see the rounded sloped side of the building there. So anyway, that's March 7th, 2020. And if you can make it, fantastic. We'll be recording everything like we usually do, but the video and all the good stuff usually happens in person. So you can find that at patreon.com/strangebrow radio. Now there's merchandise that you can find at strangebrow.com. And here's the deal, is if you buy one of the shirts or hoodies or long sleeves, we put up some interesting quotes and slogans on the back of these shirts. And it has our moniker and our logo there, which we call the Third Eye Sasquatch, representing the pineal gland. If you've seen our logo, you know what you're talking about. And if you come to this event and wear one of those shirts, let's say you wear two of those shirts, then you will be entered into a raffle. And so the more shirts that show up, well, the better the chances there are for you. So what will you win? Well, if you've ever gone on and seen one of these wood watchers I make, they are quite large faces carved out of cedar or carved out of Doug fir. And they usually retail for around $200, generally $150 to $250. The large scale ones are closer to $300. It just, the nature of working with wood, it takes some time to do it. And so usually sell out of these when I go to a conference, and they're quite large, and you can go to Facebook to check them out, and I'll put them up on the website as well at strangebrowradio.com. And that will be what we will raffle off for anyone who's wearing a t-shirt with Strange Brow logo on it. So again, these are through a website called Teespring. You order through my website, it goes through Teespring, they send you the product. I don't have to worry about it. And it helps everybody out in the end. So that's my offer to you, March 7th. Buy some of the merchandise. Well, wear a t-shirt or a hoodie. And the more people, the more t-shirts that show up, the more raffle tickets I'll hand out. And I'm planning on making something pretty special. Okay, today's guest, as I said, is Melissa Martell of the Secret Door podcast. Let's get to her and join in our discussion about psychic backlash and just exactly what she's heard and had happen, and maybe some warnings for those of you out there that are starting to look down this rabbit hole of your own. I give to you Melissa Martell. All right, Melissa Martell, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you. How are you?
Good morning. Little do people know that listen to this. We are not night owls doing a late night podcast. We are more like truckers pulled over at a rest stop right now at Bright and Early podcast, which was in lieu of an appointment that we both thought we had. And so this is pre-scheduled. Thanks for grabbing a cup of Joe and pulling over at the haunted rest stop with me.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for having me here.
Mm-hmm. Now, Melissa, you have a show of your own. It's called the Secret Door podcast, and you do it with another co-host. And is her name Lynn? Am I right about that?
It's Linnea.
Linnea, okay. Mm-hmm. And it's you and Linnea started this podcast in 2019, 2018 timeframe.
I had a podcast with another podcasting partner in 2018, and then I went on my own in 2019 with Door, and Linnea has just come on in November because I thought, well, we need to spice it up and have a co-host to come on once in a while.
Right. And so that's kind of how we all get to know one another, is through these circles here. We're talking about similar things, but you approached me about a subject matter that I think is an important one to discuss, and that's kind of like the fallout or the afterlife, the shelf life of the supernatural affecting the investigator and how that looks. Not always a great picture. For some people, it's not a good picture at all. And I wanted to go into some detail about what your experience is with the after effect of messing around with the supernatural. Because all in all, Melissa, we really don't know what we're messing with. We all have so many different guesses about who's delivering the message, what the message means, how to interpret a message, whether or not there is a message. And that makes for some interesting controversy, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's commonly known as psychic backlash, but I think if you're putting your focus intently on something that you don't know what it is, it's it's going to be iffy. It's going to be iffy how it interacts with your own life.
Okay, so this is something that you grew up with. You were born, as it says in your bio, in a haunted hospital. So I imagine you don't remember too many details about that, but you must have heard about it later. And then you grew up as a young lady, as a child in a haunted Victorian home. Those memories are a little bit closer to, what you can recall. So tell me a little bit about your history and how you got to where you are now, and then we'll move into this paranormal backlash.
Sure. Yeah, I was born on the east coast of Canada. Now, the hospital. I just can tell you stories that I've heard about it. I was born on the wing. I think it was the 8th floor, and on the 8th floor, way back when, long before I was born, there was a story about a nurse who had thrown herself from the 8th floor after a baby had respirated and died. She had committed suicide. So it sounds a lot like myth or legend, but there might be some elements of truth because everyone would say that they would have paranormal experiences in that area on the 8th floor. So it was attributed to this nurse. Now the actual hospital was demolished probably in the early 90s, but it had like a copper dome that they have standing somewhere in like a plaque because it was an old hospital. But that was the story that I would always hear about this nurse. I'm sure there's variations because it's become almost like, local folklore myth rather than, and you can't go investigate to see if anything's there because the hospital is no longer there. But it was, yeah, the nurse on the 8th floor who had committed suicide, which is, it sounds really elaborate to me. I kind of think, sounds a little more folklorish than real, but it's a hospital. So many, it could be haunted and attributed to something else because there's so much trauma and emotions happening in hospitals and sickness and illness.
Right. And there seems to be an ongoing theme of women throwing themselves out of buildings. There's at least 2-3 places I can think of within 3 hours of here that have a haunted history. One of them, of course, is the Manresa Castle where we do our live event. So have you found that in your investigations that there's a lot of damsel in distress throwing themselves out of the castle walls?
Yes, there's a lot of themes with women. Either they're in distress or they had a lover and it got discovered and they've been murdered, or they're back to reveal the real details of their death. But it's never usually a positive female ghost that's like, hey, I'm just here because I'm hanging around. They've always been done wrong, or they're over emotional or suicidal or something like that.
Yeah. Right. Do you think that's the culture breathing down the neck of folklore?
I think it goes in hand with the idea that trauma is what causes paranormal activity. I mean, a lot of people have that. So certainly if you were traumatic and hysterical, then you might leave an impression, but there's certainly some strange, it goes in hand with most paranormal experiences that usually happy spirits don't hang around too long.
Right. No. What I'm getting at, though, is the idea that the woman is in distress. Therefore, the irrational woman who kills herself and throws her out of the castle walls. You think that's something indicative of the culture? Go ahead.
I don't know this for sure, so I haven't done research on this, but I would say it wouldn't surprise me if you looked at other cultures and seen something similar.
Okay. So you don't think it's just a Western value? You think it might be a global?
It might be a Western value, but I think I'd have to go look at other cultures to be 100% sure of that, to see, okay, how do females play out in their ghost stories? But it certainly is a Western, English, Scottish sort of theme going on there.
So then you moved on to this Victorian house. You go, like, literally after the hospital, you moved in? Okay. What happened then?
We moved into that house when I was about 6, just before I started grade 1. And we moved in there. My mother was a single parent at the time, so we moved in there with another lady and her kids, and had a couple other renters, because it was quite a large house. And I mean, at the time, today you probably couldn't rent that for cheap, but this was in the early 80s, and for whatever reason they had access to it. It's owned by a private owner now. As far as I know, they don't have any issues. But when we first started moving into the house, it was my mother that she just started having. It's a similar idea with a lot of paranormal experiences, where it starts off small, like lights turning on and off by themselves. And so she just thought it was electrical stuff, or pushed it off. And then it just started to escalate over time. I mean, we only lived there for about 4 months. So it just started escalating into voices and footsteps and actual sightings of a man. And there was one particular room upstairs that this figure of a man was seen by a little boy and a couple of other people. It was constantly seen there. So I think that was sort of the epicenter of the paranormal experiences.
Okay, so you don't have any of your own memories? Are you?
Yeah.
What do you remember specifically that struck out at you?
Well, there was one instance where we were being babysat by the other lady that lived with us. Her brother and sister were there babysitting me and 3 other kids, because our parents were at work. And us kids, to put it bluntly, we knew the house was haunted by then, but we didn't say anything to these babysitters, because it was actually just becoming a normal thing for us, hearing doors creaking and experiencing certain things. So we were downstairs, all in the living room, watching television, and all of a sudden we start to hear footsteps upstairs, and the babysitters come in and they start yelling at us to stop running around and upstairs, or what were we doing? And we all looked at her and we were like, we're not upstairs, we're downstairs. Here, we're all right here. And she was sort of like, and of course I'm paraphrasing the story, it's not exact quotes, but she was like, okay, so who's upstairs? And we just kind of messed her head up and said, well, that's our ghost. And she wasn't too happy about that, but she wouldn't go upstairs. She started to freak out, and she looked at me and said, Melissa, I guess maybe I was being the cockiest. I'm not too sure why she decided that I should go upstairs and check it out. But a short story is, I sort of fake kind of half walked up the stairs. I kind of peeked around. I didn't really go up there, and I just kind of came back down and said I didn't see anything, which is true. Didn't see anything, but it was a common thing where we would hear the walking of this man upstairs. And she got in big trouble for sending me up there, by the way. When my mother came home and I told her, hey, she sent me up to look for a ghost, and she's 19 and I'm 6, and she wouldn't go up herself, my mom was not. Because from my mom's point of view, she's like, well, what if it was an intruder and not a ghost?
Yeah, sure. And so she was escorted out and never came back, or did you guys work it out?
I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure what happened. I'm not too sure. She probably just got hell from my mother. But, it's just, we were used to it. She just, when we said that, I don't know, I think she might have had a super religious background, and it might have just freaked her out. Remember, this was like 80, gosh, this would have been like 83, 84. Yeah, 80, end of 83. So she was probably hyper religious. And it kind of terrified her.
Right. Did you grow up with a family of women in your life that embrace the supernatural, paranormal?
Yes. Yeah. Well, my mom for sure. I don't know about if my grandmother was. I think she believed in some of it, but she was also skeptical. So she had a skepticism too, which is good. It's healthy to be skeptical of things and look for the logical solution first. But my mom definitely, and my grandmother's aunt was like a psychic, tea leaf reading, tarot card reading, sort of in the era of spiritualism way back when. So it's definitely there.
I gotcha. Okay. And so it was okay to talk about these things, and therefore the negative spin on talking about it, not so much the boogeyman as kind of understanding what's going on around you as being normal.
Yeah, it was okay to talk about them, but we didn't hyper. I never hyper. It wasn't like we were hyper focused on investigating or finding out what it was. So it I mean, it certainly escalated in that house. Like we had, I mean, there's several other experiences, people getting tapped, hit. We definitely started having, people were arguing more. You definitely were having problems financially, lost jobs. And after for 4 months, we left. I mean, it was starting to cost a fortune to heat the house because it was run on oil. Big oil tanks. It was on an old heating system. It wasn't like electric. So it started to become unaffordable to heat. And my mom wanted a place that had more modern, facilities, to put it blunt. So we eventually left, but it would just escalate. It was getting more where like you started to attribute everything to it. So if you fell down the stairs, it felt like you've been tripped. You'd be like, I think that spirit did it. So whether or not it did, I don't know, but everything started to get really chaotic, and we just, the bills were getting out of hand and people's lives were getting really chaotic. So we just left after 4 months.
Yeah, well, the oil thing alone, I've known people that have had to make sudden moves because that is really costly. If you've never had to pay an oil heating bill before, you wouldn't really know. But interesting. So I'm always fascinated by how people grow up learning about magic or the supernatural. And oftentimes it's impacted by their own worldview, which is usually fear-based. And I'm not getting a lot of that off of you. So after this moment, after living, at a tender age in a haunted house, do you start seeking out the supernatural on your own, or what happens to you through middle school and high school? I imagine there's probably some inquiry.
You know what? I never really dealt with the paranormal too heavy. I might have like bought books here and there on like Lloyd Auerbach. I might have bought a book on parapsychology, had a little bit of an interest, but I wasn't hyper involved in the paranormal. I was more like, I had a fascination with like anything to do with vampires and Dracula when I was in high school. That was really trendy. Interview with the Vampire, stuff like that. And English literature. I was more into a lot of literature and looking at writings and books on what they would it would have been some sort of like not just vampires but Frankenstein or anything sort of macabre in a romantic sort of macabre
Gothic.
literature. Gothic, thank you.
Yes, there's the word.
Yeah, there's the word.
I mean, I often wonder what happened to all my Gothic friends from high school and whether or not they are still looking into the angles of the supernatural. And what's so hysterical about all this is it was fashion over substance. It was style over substance most of the time, but that's not what you're saying. You're saying you actually were trying to get to the substance of it all and understand where the style came from and what the reality of the supernatural is. I don't think most of these goth kids that I knew back then actually were doing that. I was more of an artsy fartsy guy, and but I always was curious about what the real story of the supernatural was, and it seemed like goth was really the only angle you could take through those formative years to understand that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it totally. It's
Mm-hmm.
sort of I mean, a lot of it's like cultural, visual, a lot of goth. I mean, you're going to be influenced by a lot of things that are in the media. So
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't know about goth unless you've seen like a lot. I know a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Brit goths who still are involved in. They don't obviously look like goths anymore, but they are involved in like cryptozoology or doing speeches and uh, investigations in Britain. I think it's a little different in the UK, or they are occult. They started out doing goth, and they
Mm-hmm.
now do research on the occult or lecture about Aleister Crowley or Thelema, or they've taken that over to film or whatever it is they do in their life. So I do
Mm-hmm.
know some people where it's transferred over into a career. So it's just fascinating, but that's more the UK based. So I think it might be a little more acceptable there, or people are
Mm-hmm.
just maybe it's a smaller landmass and people
Mm-hmm.
closer together. I don't know.
Well, this ostracization of the youth, being separated as the one that wears black and that understands that their music is better and darker than
Yeah,
the
yeah,
lunch
yeah.
table next to them. That when you're separated like that, it separates your ideas as being wholly yours, and you're not going to share these ideas with other people. Therefore, you won't learn from these other experiencers around you that are probably much more entrenched in the supernatural and more goth than you, but
Yeah.
they just don't know how to talk about it. And yet here we are, we've kind of embraced it cloak and dagger style. So I think that carries on outside of, the high school years are so formative, and so much of, me, I'll just say, is still kind of looking back at those 4 years in public schools at Thurston High School. Do you still find yourself going back there and kind of like, okay, I don't have to be the weirdo anymore, I'm just going to kind of live it as I want to live it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the other thing about people today who are younger may not realize, like when I was in high school, to access some of the content or books, you had to really scour around and order things in and go to bookstores. You just couldn't go on the internet and have free access to so many people. So it's not
Mm,
just the goth thing, it was just the whole reality of you didn't have easy access to information as well, or people
mhm.
all around the world.
Right. And if you went to a public bookstore, usually the books that you wanted to find or I wanted to find were kind of in the darkened corners in the back of the
Hmm.
bookstore. And
Yeah.
that's where they kept all the porn, usually. You know what I mean? Like it was just like,
Yeah.
okay, so the porn's back here. I guess it's right next to the mummies and the
Oh,
vampires. So, you
yeah,
know,
we're the
right,
weirdos in the back of the bookstore.
right. Yeah, so that those qualities carry out into adulthood, and then we kind of shield ourselves away. And the nice thing about your podcast is that you look for other people to have these shared experiences, and you talk about all sorts of stuff besides the ghost aspect of this. You talk about things like sleep paralysis, and I was extremely struck by the magical history of alcohol. You were talking about
Oh,
things like
yeah.
mead and absinthe and things like that. Tell us a little bit about that podcast in particular.
Well, we had Rojan from Project Archivist come on, and I'm not a professional brewmeister, but Rojan has a lot of experience brewing alcohol. So we're just talking about alcohol in relation to witches and the history of it. And so, of course, it sort of falls in line the similar idea as like the medical history, where men were taking over the medical sort of sector and villainizing a lot of women as witches because saying they were poisoning people or it was witchcraft, and they were just using herbs to try and heal people. Well, same
Mm,
thing with alcohol. Women started off selling alcohol and making money. It was like a business for them. They weren't really witches, and they're sort of villainized as, because men wanted to take over this business. A lot of men wanted to take over this business, so they just sort of were like, they're a witch, kind of. That's to pack it up into a small little sentence. It's a lot of villainizing women because it's a
mm-hmm.
business competition, essentially, because they were making good money off of brewing beer and wine and different spirits.
And what about the supernatural aspect of where the word spirits comes from attached to alcohol? Is there any history on the name
Oh,
spirits being attached to liquor?
I'm not sure. I can't remember what Rojan said.
Mm-hmm.
Can't even remember if we asked him about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to give an answer because it's like 7 a.m. and I can't remember exactly what we said there.
All right.
I'm sure there is some sort of idea where,
Mm-hmm.
I would connect it with this whole idea that
Mm-hmm.
alcohol actually changes alcohol actually changes your whole personality. So it has almost a mood of its own, a
Yeah.
personality of its own.
Well, that one struck out at me. I thought we'd talk about that briefly here because it's of interest. And if anybody's ever ordered an absinthe in a little darkened pub, then you'd know quickly that there's a whole ceremony that goes
Mm-hmm.
with pouring absinthe and the qualities, the hallucinogenic qualities at one time of drinking the Green Fairy are pretty well noted with artists and poets and things like that. So,
Yeah, and it's kind of like a gateway thing. Like there's a lot of like ideas that alcohol is like a gateway to opening yourself up to being affected by negative spirits. But whether or not I don't know about that, maybe addiction,
mm-hmm,
but it certainly is. A lot of drugs are seen as gateways to different spirits or different um,
mm-hmm,
portals or whatever it is you would have. But we know actually it's poison and it's actually just affecting you physiologically. So maybe that's an older way of
mm-hmm.
saying that, right?
Well, the last podcast I did was with a group of guys, and they're on the East Coast, and they brought up substance abuse in the community of the supernatural and paranormal as a form of how to deal with a type of PTSD. And it
Mm-hmm.
gets us to where we're probably headed, the supernatural backlash. You've seen this before. I've seen this before. I'll say it. I've experienced it before where you just kind of, alcohol is a really great numbing system and let go of your inhibitions after a few. So, as far as the supernatural hanging on and the consequences of looking into the supernatural, is that something you've seen in the community? People that have had severe or codependency issues with substances?
Oh, absolutely. I don't want to get into any personal relationships or mention anybody that I've seen this with because it just wouldn't be fair because they're not here to, talk about themselves. But I've definitely seen it where people have had addictive personalities, had suffer trauma from a young age. They were now into the paranormal and they almost seem to have like a black cloud of a thing following around them. And when you got intensely engaged with them and engaged in the paranormal, strange things started to happen. Like money started going bad, things flew off shelves. The relationship just started deteriorating. They started, hallucinations, paranoia. It's what happens when you're not really balanced in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that kind of, a lot of times the word attachments is thrown around about this black cloud. Sometimes I feel like the attachment is, those 2 fists of vodka in the freezer waiting for this researcher when they get home.
Well,
And
and
it's, alcoholism, right?
yeah, well, and sometimes I think that black thing, mass attached to people, has nothing to do with the alcohol as well. It could have something to do with some severe trauma that they had in childhood, and it's created almost a split. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's actually part of them, but they're projecting it out.
Mm-hmm.
Negative, dark self that's standing there. You see, so what I found with some people is you get like a Jekyll and Hyde. You think they're a sweet, nice person, but then they flip on a dime. Like it's almost like they're triggered by something that you do, and you don't intend it to be bad. You're just saying something normal, and
Mm-hmm.
they're triggered by it, and that dark shadow that's hovering comes out, takes over the personality. And alcohol makes that worse. So when they drink or they're having alcohol or substance, that dark, whatever that thing is that's rooted to the trauma comes right out and starts operating. And you're like, who is this person? And it's sort of the crux of like a lot of alcoholism and abusive relationships. And you get this Jekyll and Hyde personality where you almost don't even know who the person is at times.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that can happen. And alcohol just, makes it happen really quickly. So there's something about alcohol that brings out some dark stuff in certain people. Some people can have 1 or 2 drinks and they're fine and they're happy, but some people, they can't stop, and it brings out this sort of weird, dark thing that's on them.
Now, do you ever have a nip before you go out on an investigation?
No, never.
Oh, really?
No.
Okay, tell me about that, because I'm guilty of having a nip before an investigation. Sure.
I haven't been on very many investigations lately because of work, pay the bills. But I've always gone. I mean, sometimes I've gone to a pub and maybe had a drink just because we're at the pub, and I've had an experience at the pub, but I was just maybe 1 drink with dinner. But I've started to go, okay, look, if you really want to say you're having a paranormal experience, you've got to be pretty honest with yourself and be sober. Otherwise, someone could attribute it to drinking. And I've had a lot of people say, well, I've had this paranormal experience, but I had 4 beers. And I'm going, okay, well, that right away, if you want to be pretty serious that, or if you're serious about your data, then you can't have 4 drinks, because that's right there. You've just sort of ruined anyone. Well, not ruined, but someone's going to point that out. So I if I was going to go out, especially go out to a building where it might be ransacked, or the structures, and 100%, I kind of want to be
right.
100% able to use my facilities.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea. And there's a difference between having a glass of wine with a meal and someone dealing with a traumatic experience that is about to occur, and they have to numb themselves before and after that experience. And I think the latter is a little more common, especially when it comes to all the Sasquatch stuff in particular. When you get around a campfire and you're sitting out in the woods, if you have some hard alcohol and it's cold outside, you're not going to feel that cold as much after a couple of hard drinks. And so I see that a lot in the community that does a lot of supernatural investigations outside. And, it's unfortunately broken up some friendships. Have you had to deal with friendships and researchers that you just can't babysit them any longer?
Yeah. And I mean, any paranormal experience I've ever had, I mean, no alcohol's ever been involved. And I think it's probably more fleeting than you think. Like it's the one thing about investigations. I am always like, I really don't think I'm going to find anything, because any experience I've ever had was sort of like, it wasn't at night and I had a camera and spooky scenario. It was, maybe even in the middle of the day while I'm washing the dishes, all of a sudden something happened and then it was gone. So it's so quick and so fleeting. Sometimes I'm always thinking, well, the chances of me, going into a building for 2 or 3 hours and finding something is probably slim to none, because I always look at the paranormal, but it's ESP, ghosts, stuff like that, not necessarily Sasquatches. I've never had any of that experience, but I always look at that as so fleeting and momentary that it's sort of like trying to catch your breath in your hand.
Right. And so we're talking about a chemical reaction, chemical dependency. What about a spiritual reaction, a spiritual dependency, a paranormal dependency? It seems to, I mean, I know you've seen this before. I have too, where people get so immersed that they've lost themselves. They've given themselves over to the other side of the looking glass. I've had to separate myself from those people as well. Have you?
Well, yeah, because that's the one thing that I sort of looked at when I was looking at this is, okay, when you're dealing with psychic backlash, what are you going in there with? So a lot of people, like, I won't say any names, but I've interviewed people before, and I've talked to them when they're going in there and they've lost family members. They're not mentally well. They already have depression, and they get a rise out of being involved in the paranormal. And so it sort of becomes something that they have to do, and they do it intensely because it's sort of replacing what they've lost, and they're going at it with certain energies or certain mind frame that dictates that, how they're going to interact with it. I mean, if you are depressed, or you're highly negative, or you do sort of negative rituals, or you're angry at the world, you have mental health problems, you're going to walk into something. And it's that Nietzsche quote again, it's that, if you gaze long enough into the abyss, it gazes right back into you, and you get a reflection of what is part of you. So it's almost reading you, and it's saying, okay, you want to focus on me? Here, let's focus on you. And you might get something back that you weren't expecting.
Right. Have you seen a consistent deviation more so in men or women delving down too deep into the rabbit hole?
Well, I would be really generalizing to say that I think men can get more focused and intense on one thing, where I think women might be a little bit better at balancing. Now, that doesn't mean that every man and every woman, it's that way for all of them. But I think when I've heard a lot of these stories, a lot of it is with men who get super, super hyper focused, because that tends to be what they do is they take one topic and they want to really focus on it, do it well, and get it done. And they can get really intense, whereas women will balance it a little bit better. But that doesn't mean women don't do it. It just maybe the majority of women don't.
Right. But what if something's calling on a man differently than it's calling on a woman? And there's
absolutely.
Yeah, I wonder about the message coming from the source towards two different types of genetic structures, how this interpretation of a man and I've talked to Alex Whitcomb. I know you've recently done a podcast with Alex, and he's doing a remote viewing class with us, but Alex and I spoke about this too, about how men deal with the supernatural differently. And I can't but help hearken back to the power of The Ring and the Lord of the Rings series, where there's this yearning to understand what this ring is and the great power and the ego behind going into where the Eye of Sauron is. So although the power is equally destructive on women, it seems like men time and time again are willing to sacrifice anything and everything and be seduced and groomed by the supernatural. Do you see what I mean?
Yo, absolutely, absolutely. Whereas I mean that happens with careers. I mean, that happens in general over, men are more likely to go for the dangerous jobs. Men are more likely to pursue careers, whereas where women, it's not that women won't pursue careers and do good and are not high achievers. They are. But when they have children, or when they get into that motherly stage, they're like, no, this is more important to me. That tends to, and I know people are going to say that's sexist. It's not sexist. It's natural. It's healthy for women to want to raise babies, right, and love their children. There's nothing wrong with that. But women tend to try to want to balance it out and put a lot of their energy into nurturing, their families and stuff. So it's different. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with men. There's nothing wrong with women. It's just how it is, right? It's just.
I know. I just love the fact that we kind of have to, qualify every
I'm not
room.
being sexist. It's just how it is. I do the same thing. I don't go on investigations. My son comes first and what he needs when he's around. It's important, right?
Right. Now, I think a guy might take more risk with the family. I'm speaking honestly here. I'm certainly a guy that has taken more risk leaving behind family members to investigate into a mystery, the supernatural. And I've seen other guys do it way more hardcore than me. And it's interesting about the psychic backlash or the supernatural backlash. It seems like it's just way more severe when a guy does it.
Yeah, and it's relative. So if you're leaving your family and you're taking off and you're hyper focusing and neglecting your family and you're hyper focusing on the paranormal, well, don't be surprised if your family starts falling apart, you start having troubles at home. That could be part of the psychic backlash, but it's also cause and effect. Yeah. Yeah.
And I can see why you say that this is also a quality of men when they're invested in working too much, or guys that are super invested into a sports team or hunting.
Mhm.
But there's something unique about the fact of what you said with Nietzsche. The NFL isn't looking back at you. They have no
No,
contact with you. They don't know that you know,
exactly.
paint your face. Something here is intently studying you, and it
Yeah.
wants to communicate with you.
Well, and like, I'm not saying everything's demons and whether demons exist or not, but if you've got some type of, like, you don't know what you're going for. Like, I had someone on my podcast who had actually in Washington State, he had what he would call a poltergeist, and he thought it was a kid at first in the house, but it actually wasn't. It was just pretending to be a kid. So you don't know what you're going for at. It could be pretending to be one thing and then switch it's something negative. And if you've got some kind of demonic, or you've got some sort of spirit or something's happening in the house, sometimes they'll take on whatever you're reflecting. They'll copy your psyche and they'll just reflect it back at you, and you could be horrified, but it could be saying something about you and about your life. And sometimes they take on as well, like my ex podcast partner, he had experiences where he would see whatever it was in the building shift, and so he felt that the spirit was taking on like a druid, because he was by a stone circle, and he thought, oh well, that's really obvious, it's almost reading my mind, I'm expecting to see a druid around here. So once he thought that in his mind, it started to shift into something else, so it was almost reflecting like what it thought he wanted it to be, or just trying to read his mind and appear as what was the most obvious in the human collective consciousness. So it's not this evil thing stand there on its own. It's interacting with you. So you're part of it. And so you're part of the psychic backlash. So it can't, it's not like you are both in bubbles and you're not interacting. You're actually interacting with it. And
Right.
yeah.
And the interesting part is that folks listening to this podcast, you may feel the urge to do this yourself. You may say, I see qualities of what Melissa and Tobe are talking about in myself. The curious part to really look at is you're not making, most of these people are not making a dime from this. It's not rewarding to the whole of the family. It's merely self-involvement. And it's really curious to me because you so many people are trying to make a dime at this, and it's nearly impossible to do, but yet people don't stop doing it. So that describes how deep the addiction is. In fact, it's quite costly to do this. More and more it's getting to be lesser so, but in the beginning it certainly was. But as far as things that you steered away from, I've interviewed and spoken to friends of mine that have felt as though there was something they cannot do. They felt as though, I want to try this new, let's say Reiki or remote viewing or something of that nature, and they feel supernaturally propelled away from that. Have you found that in your own life, that there's something that you wanted to get into that you weren't allowed to do?
As in not allowed to do because it's just
Well,
doesn't
because you
happen.
you had a message, or you had a dream, or you felt
Oh.
sick, something that pushed you away from it, some kind of
Um
magical discipline, we'll say.
well, I don't know about that, but I've certainly hmm I'm certainly more inclined to steer away from something that feels like a cult
Mm-hmm.
or a group where there's rules where you have to think a certain way. And I certainly take my time getting involved with groups because I've done lots of research on cults. But I mean, I've had and speaking of that, I've done a podcast on a certain particular cult leader that we didn't name operating online, and apparently they were putting a curse on me. Whether or not it worked, I don't know. But he was calling out his minions to put a curse on me, but he didn't really name me. And it was really bizarre. But I don't. I just, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
I tend to like to stick to my own faculties and my own
Mm-hmm.
mind and be really super independent and
Mm-hmm.
take time getting involved in things, because usually I come from it at a psychological point of view where there's a lot of people, especially on the internet, who may have personality disorders. And it's been my experience, I've been in a relationship with someone who had borderline personality disorder, is that if you get involved too fast and it's too like and it's like really quickly and they want to have you on their fast, that's like a red flag.
Mm-hmm. Have you
For
have you ever been invited into a secret school of some sort by an individual and declined?
No, not that I remember.
Yeah.
I get invitations from the Illuminati all the time.
No.
That's a joke. That's actually not a joke. I do, but it's just a scam.
Well, now wait a second. I'm slightly offended. I don't get the same invitations, but
Yeah.
I can live without them. Now
Yeah.
you're being serious.
No, I'm actually not being. I'm actually being serious that I get invitations to Illuminati, but I'm pretty sure it's just some crazy person setting up a scam.
Oh,
You get
gotcha.
all
Okay.
you get all this stuff in Messenger, like join the
Okay.
Illuminati and we'll teach you how to make lots of money. And I'm like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you will. Where are
Mm-hmm.
you again?
Now, I've spoken to people that say that they've actually been invited by secret societies, and they claim that it starts off with a very simple letter in the mail. And then if you read this book or you read this blah, 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 and then send back an agreement of some sort, they will get in touch with you. But you've never been approached in
No,
that way.
no, and I wouldn't respond to it if I
Mm-hmm.
had that in my mail. I wouldn't respond to it because that's
Mm-hmm.
I'm not comfortable with secret anything where
Mm-hmm.
even though my podcast Secret Door, but
Mm-hmm.
you won't be getting a letter in the mail from me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not comfortable with people sending out letters to
Mm-hmm.
invite you into societies where you have a strict rigid rules, and if you don't follow them you're shunned, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not comfortable with that because that's the starting of a cult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's to me it's like, no, everything should be on the table and
Mm-hmm.
transparent. And if you're too secret and there has to be all these rules and I have to pass all these tests, and
Mm-hmm.
you know what, that doesn't work for me.
Right. Well, with a name like Secret Door, tell people what you mean by naming your podcast that.
Well, it's I didn't want to have a podcast that was like, oh, we're just doing ghosts or we're just doing something. And I'm like, well, what are we doing? I'm like, well, we're kind of opening doors up to information that people don't normally talk about. They keep secret. So Secret Door Podcast sounds good.
Perfect.
But I didn't want to pigeonhole it into we
Mm-hmm.
only talk about ghosts or we only
Right.
talk about, because I mean technically we want to do a lot of alternative spirituality sort of techniques and helping people. Like I know that's Linnea's big thing, is she likes to help people ground and release stuff and get more to know themselves. So we're mixing the paranormal in with this idea of just living a better life and a lot of psychology as well.
Is there a door you won't open?
I don't like I leave that up to guests that come on. I don't like to get too super personal beyond someone's. I won't ever push someone somewhere where they're comfortable, and I also won't outright, even if I think somebody, I know the answer, I would never call somebody a liar and be overly confrontational and make someone feel uncomfortable on my podcast.
Right.
Because in my opinion, some people may say you're a fraud, you're a charlatan, psychic stuff doesn't exist. But in my opinion, it's not my job to tell somebody that didn't happen to them.
Right.
They believe it really happened to them. So it's my job to have a discussion about what they believed happened and maybe help them ground or let go of it or whatever it is.
And what about doors that you may not open because of the psychic backlash involved with it? Is there a door that you won't open in that way?
Well, I did open the door to cults, and apparently I got curses put on me. So that's one that I'd have to see how I feel about talking about different cults. I do like to expose cults. Like on my older podcast, we talked about John of God, who's a who, if anyone hasn't read about him, he's actually now being sentenced to prison, and he was endorsed by Oprah back in the day as his healer, and he was actually running a human farm where he was getting all the young girls locally coming to his compound and impregnating them, entrapping them, and selling the babies on the black market, and highly abusing everyone, and possible murder, et cetera, et cetera. So I do like to talk and expose things like that, because I think you don't need a big compound to be in a cult. You just need 2 or 3 people. So I'm trying to tell people, be self-regulating. Don't just run into things, because I think a lot of people are lonely and they don't know where to go, and they may have come from abusive background, and they're easy to manipulate into cults. So but I'm leery on what door to open on that, because the psychic backlash could be you get a really big group making hell for your life.
And they're so litigious too. The Church of Scientology being a huge one. If you talk about them publicly, you get a cease and desist letter. I've seen that in a couple podcasts.
Yeah. It's why I won't watch everyone likes Tom Cruise. I'm like, dude, he's a Church of Scientology. I won't watch his movies. If you give up talking to your children for the Church of Scientology, you're a scumbag in my book. So I won't do a Tom Cruise movie. I know people may love him, but I'm like, yeah, no, that's not cool.
No, I battle with the Tom Cruise disorder, and I hate myself for it.
I know he's a great actor, but he probably would never give up Church of Scientology. They probably have too much dirt on him.
Is that the way you think it works?
Well, they do. They get you to go into all these auditory stuff, and you have to tell them all your stuff to get to the next levels. And it's like a clearing, cleansing stuff. So Tom's been there for a long time. They've got a lot of dirt on him. He probably believes this stuff. I mean, he doesn't even talk to his own daughter because she's not in the church. So they tell you they're a defector. You don't talk to people who aren't in the church. You ignore them. So to me, anybody who would do that to their own flesh and blood, I'm like, yeah. So, and I have no doubt that one of the reasons he's so successful is because he's a Scientologist. And he's a really intense guy that, I don't know, his energy bothers me.
Right. It's these secret handshakes that go on in Hollywood where they all belong to the same crazy, sex parties or whatever they're doing. I mean, you've already spoken about it with John of God. There's the other guy that would brand his women right on the hip and put that crazy mark on their hip and kind of say, this is my cattle and these are my sex slaves. It seems to end that direction with guys that are cult leaders. Have you found that with women as well? Are they primarily interested in sex and power?
Oh, women can be cult leaders just as much as men. There's lots of cult-like women who channel spirits and have a following. Absolutely. I can't name one. I mean, Oprah Winfrey would probably be a good example. Most of us wouldn't think of her as a cult leader, but she kind of had a little bit of a kind of cult. Although you could leave, you weren't held to Oprah Winfrey. She could say something and people would do it. And the problem with her is, like, she was telling people to go to John of God, so she was kind of inadvertent, and she's involved with the Weinstein. I'm not even going to get into Harvey Weinstein, but she's actually like this gateway for leading people into bad circumstances. Now, in saying that, you can't be a cult leader without having people who are willing to follow cult leaders. So it's on both ends. There's a psychology about the people who will follow that is like that the individual who has that psychology, they have to deal with that. Otherwise, they'll just go from cult to cult to cult to cult. I mean, Linnea, my co-host, I mean, she grew up with religious cult stuff that her mother was in, and there's a certain psychology. It has nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. It's a psychology where they need this absolute leader to idolize, to make them feel that they're super special and involved in some super special spirituality. And so the cult leader is nothing without people like that, and they're already like that before they meet the cult leader.
Right. And I mean, it gets into dangerous ground, especially if you're doing a podcast where you have certain religions that are not Scientology, not John of God, not Jay-Z Knight, but they are billion-dollar industries that have lasted for eons, and they're part of your listening audience. Have you steered away or corrected your speech in fear of
I haven't
losing?
yet.
No.
I haven't yet. I'm not really worried about, I figure, you know what, we're going to be ourselves and we say what we say, and the people who are listening, they'll stay, and the ones who don't want to, we probably don't want them around anyway, so they can go.
Right.
I don't worry about it too much, although, I mean, if I felt it was too dangerous to talk about, I probably just would be like, okay, let's not talk about that. Let's steer, like, because I do believe in law of attraction in the sense, not that, oh, if I think about a car, it's going to show up, in the sense that your emotions and your thoughts do eventually manifest your life. So if I'm hyper, that comes back into psychic backlash. If I'm hyper focused on something that's really negative, well, it's going to show up and in different ways that I might not even be expecting.
Right. I mean, it's up into a sort of interpretation, and we're having a loose conversation regarding psychic backlash or paranormal backlash. Do you mean paranormal backlash as well, or are you encompassing thoughts becoming things? That I'm trying to understand your interpretation of the backlash as it pertains to the word psychic being attached to it.
A psychic, that term was something that was coined by John Downes from the Center for Fortean Zoology, I believe. He coined that when he that's just the name he called it when he was on paranormal investigations or investigating some sort of cryptid, that he would notice that things would start going wrong in his life, where cats, you know, he'd have 2 or 3 cats that have to be put down, financial ruin, you know, a whole bunch of stuff would start happening when he got hyper focused on a specific topic. And it was always paranormal or cryptid in nature, his topics, and he just coined it psychic backlash because there's some psychological thing that's happening there when and I think he's referring to the whole thing. Intense focus on an object or study agitates the object, and then the object reflects stuff back at you. It starts throwing things back at you. And so that's where I got that term from. So it could encompass, and he's using it basically for the paranormal and cryptozoology. But I think it operates on a whole bunch of different levels, and it probably comes from law of attraction and what you focus, and the fact that you're interacting with you don't even know what.
Right. And do you think that just living in a spot where the activity is abnormally high can have the same kind of backlash effect, even if the person isn't focusing on it, just merely having a house in the spot?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think it can be inadvertently, because it's going to be very hard if you're living in a house to ignore for very long, unless you're some kind of Buddhist Zen master. It's going to be very hard to ignore paranormal activities or poltergeist activities, and especially if you've never experienced it before and you have no concept of what it is, it's going to trigger your emotions. See, a lot of these things at the base, when they happen, trigger people's emotions. So it depends, like I said, on your psychological base, on your mental health, and maybe even on your diet. It could get into that. But it is eventually going to start playing on your mind and your emotions, and you're going to start interacting with it. And people say, well, you could control it. I'd say, you know what? It's probably just easier to move. Because unless you're some kind of Zen master, which most of us aren't, I'm not, eventually I'm going to start responding to something that's creating chaos. If I leave and come home and everything's a mess every day, or my cabinet's open and things are thrown around, I'm going to start getting frustrated and tired and exhausted, and it could drain your energy. So I'm going to start lashing out and responding, and it's going to create more of what's going on. And I mean, who knows? It could just want it more attention. Your focus on it could actually feed it and make it more real, for all I know.
Right. And we're not just talking about ghosts either. We're talking about people that live in UFO hotspots, people that live in time distortion spots, where portals are, where Sasquatch is, where cryptids are. All of those, do you think those have consequences to living in areas, negative consequences?
Sure. Absolutely, especially if you're like some UFO hotspot and there's a lot of electromagnetic energy, or like you would have to investigate the environment and see, like, do you have like high EMF, like that can affect your what's the acoustics like that can affect your ability to
Mm-hmm.
like anything in your environment. Like, are there power lines over where you are? Like, everything will affect you. So
Mm-hmm.
if you've got some hotspot where people are constantly experiencing stuff, I would be surprised if it's not highly charged with certain energies and frequencies that are going to affect you, even if you weren't seeing a
Mm-hmm.
UFO landing.
But
So
things you could test and measure.
you could, yeah.
Yeah, right.
I
I
mean, there
know.
are things you can eliminate.
Right. When we were in Sedona a couple of years ago, going on a UFO hunt, one of the things that we were shocked to experience physically, besides sun, was electricity and static electricity coming off of our hands. And nobody told us about that. And that definitely was some backlash because you were constantly zapping one another. And I think it just had to do with all the quartz in the sand
Yeah.
and shifting your feet around. But yeah, I may play a part in why there's so much activity in Sedona.
But like if you have an area like Hope, BC, where people are seeing Sasquatch, there's two things I suppose that could happen, or maybe more. But there's the stories that get told that actually create, fear.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's actually the real experiences that creates that you interact with. So there's two things going on there. There's the real experiences that people are reporting to have, and then there's the stories and the legends and the rumors that get perpetuated about it. So
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to separate which one's affecting you.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've been into supposed haunted locations and experienced absolutely nothing, but there's all these stories going around where you think you would have, like, if you focused on it enough and you were investigating it 6, 7, 8 times a year, something would happen, but nothing's
Mm-hmm.
ever happened. But I think it definitely has something to do with your psyche and your mind and your emotions and where you're putting it,
Mm-hmm.
and what you're doing and what you're feeling and
Mm-hmm.
interacting. If you cut that off and you're somehow able to investigate something and be more
Mm-hmm.
balanced and not be as hyper focused, I don't think the backlash is going to be as severe.
Mm-hmm. Near where you are, what's the strangest place near you, and do you frequent it?
The closest place that I've been to, well, there's a couple places. I live in Comox Valley, so there's a haunted manor house, and I've actually, the lady who owns it, she's been trying to sell it, but it's a old, like 100-year-old manor house that's in the business area, so nobody seems to want to buy it. But that's supposedly haunted. It's actually been on the news, and I actually asked her about it, and she said, yeah, well, she hadn't seen it for a while, but she reported like glasses and cups. Now, I haven't actually been in there, so I never had any experience. I haven't actually been in her house and had that experience, but I was at her studio on the grounds and I was asking her about it. So there's that. There's a few places in Cumberland that seem to be fairly haunted, like the old
Mm-hmm.
is it the Waverly Hotel?
Mm-hmm.
I'm bad with names. And I would say there's probably a lot of Sasquatch sightings around there too, just because
Mm-hmm.
of being surrounded by the woods. I haven't had any massive paranormal experiences in my town. All my paranormal experiences have been on the East Coast, or having to do with someone recently passing away and showing
Mm-hmm.
back up after and leaving. That has been here, so it hasn't been tied to a location. It was tied to a person passing away.
Mm-hmm.
But all the locations that are said to be haunted, I've never had any experiences at them personally when I've gone there.
Right. If money and time weren't an issue, and daycare or childcare, where would you go? What would be the
I
place that you would love to see?
I would go to the United Kingdom, probably
Mm-hmm.
stay in a place that I don't have a place off the top of my head, but I probably choose some place that, like some sort of old pub that was
Mm-hmm.
really had a lot of activity, and just stay in there
Mm-hmm.
for a long time without anybody there.
Mm-hmm.
if it was in Canada, on the island, I'd probably head down to Victoria because that tends to be a hot spot. For like most of the stories are coming out of Victoria, and they have a really intense. If I was going to go to a used bookstore, I'd go to Victoria because you can find a lot of used occult old books there more likely than anywhere else, because they tend to be more accepting of ghosts and the paranormal there. Yeah.
Do you find they're more accepting overseas than they are in the West?
I don't know about all of Europe, but United Kingdom tends to have a more I guess open approach to discussing stuff. Like if I talk about ghosts or paranormal here, people are like, yeah, whatever, that's just silly. Like I would never bring it up at work. I would never bring it up just generally. I would only bring it up to people I know are going to be receptive to the conversation, because there's really no point in bringing it up, because most people just look at you like you've got worms crawling out of your head. And I've tried. Yeah,
they can't tell at work, Melissa, that you're into
it. There's probably a couple of people who know, but in general, no. They can't. It's not really quite obvious. I don't walk around with goth makeup on, or a logo T-shirt on my.
You're not walking. Yeah, you're not walking into the break room with an EMF meter.
Yeah, I'm not dressed up like Ghostbusters or anything like that. No. So I don't talk about when I go to work. When I go to work, I'm at work. I'm professional, and this stuff stays here. So that's probably actually why a good thing to do.
Right. It reminds me a little bit of the high school days yet again, where school is school and work is work. But it's. Do you ever feel like you just want to break out the EMF meter, so to speak, or turn up the podcast that you're listening to while you're on the break, or hear a conversation in the hallway? And I find myself doing that once in a while, where I want to immerse myself in it even when I'm at work.
I don't want to immerse myself in it at work. I just don't want to go. I just don't want to go to work, and I want to stay focusing and talking to people from my office at home.
Right.
I'm like, nah, I just don't want to go to work, because it's a big, and there's so many people. There's so much energy going on. There's so much movement, and it's hard to focus anyway. So I usually do I even have to go there? I'm so busy doing this. I just don't want to stop designing this or working on this podcast or researching for this topic. And I mean, the other thing about my podcast, not focusing on one topic, I find it's easier that I jump around. So I could do something on a witch one day, healing the other day. I find it's actually good to jump around to topics like that, so I don't get too hyper focused. So if I did everything on Satanism, that might actually create some kind of crazy, I'd be a little leery of that.
All right. Now, have you ever had a guest get a hold of you after production and ask you to scrub their interview?
Yes, I have.
And how did you deal with that?
Well, what was really weird is it was on Modern Fairy Sightings, and they sent the list of questions. I told them they were leery about coming on information. I said, well, you write up the questions that you're comfortable with, and I'll ask you that. I have actually no problem with that. And so I asked them all their questions, and they came back and they wanted to listen to it before I put it out and have editorial rights on it. And I was like, well, what was it that you said that you're uncomfortable with? So I tried to bleep it out, and I put it out, and they didn't like it. They wanted me to edit this. They had all this way. They wanted to control how it was edited, because they didn't like the information, the question, and that the answer. I said, but you gave me the question. I didn't, so it just, they wanted hyper control, because they were really, they were really uncomfortable with the fact that they had revealed their own, like they wrote about it, but they never really talked about their own modern fairy sightings, and they got really uncomfortable with it after it was out, and they didn't want it to be out there. So I just said, you know what? I said, I don't let people edit my show, and I find this is really inappropriate. So I'm taking it down.
Right.
That's the easiest thing to do. You're uncomfortable with. I don't really like your behavior trying to edit my show and hyper control everything. So I'm just taking it down. And I just took it down. And they were like, okay.
Well, I'll be bummed if you
or
ask me to
left-handed.
take this one down. So
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
No,
I wouldn't
it's
ask you to take it down.
it's very rare. And in my case, it's only happened on one occasion, and it was over kind of a similar circumstance that you just described, where it seemed like they had to control the narrative so tight, so close. It's just like it's easier for everybody right now if we just didn't talk. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Let's just
Yeah.
take it down, right?
It's like, because I always say to people, it's being recorded. Everything you say could possibly go on to the podcast. So only say things you want. And I actually gave them pre-podcast control by saying what could be asked. And
Right.
I had no problem with that as long as they were comfortable. But I won't have someone harass me and try to edit the entire podcast.
And this is podcast backlash. I didn't expect to be.
Yeah, podcast backlash.
Yeah, right.
I'm like, go make your own podcast then.
Right. Well, what do you have coming up as far as Melissa's concerned? It's a new year, 2020. I'm sure you have your sights on growing the show, or do you have anything that you're working on privately that you want to talk about and maybe break a little news here? Or what's going on in Melissa's world?
We're going to be doing a Facebook Live event on January 31st, the Q&A with our show. I'm on the 24th of January. I'm going to be on What the Frick podcast as a guest. I'm working on a show about, I don't know, you may not know him, but he was a professor, a witch, and a Wiccan exorcist sort of priest he lived in Victoria. He was from England. His name was Robin Skelton. He's passed away, but he's written a lot of really interesting books on spellcraft and his experiences of exorcising ghosts. So I'm researching and doing a show where me and Linnea are going to talk about the power of words and spellcraft and how that's powerful in rituals and getting what you want. And I've got a few guests lined up for February, but I still have yet to plan. A lot of people will plan months in ahead, and that just doesn't work for me. I have to go with what happens and what comes, and usually I'm maybe a few weeks ahead, but I'm never months ahead in booking because my schedule's too all over the place to guarantee that. But I am going for that. And we have somebody from customs. He was involved in customs who wants to come on and talk about conspiracy theories with the U.S. Customs. I'm like, I'm a little, the secret door, I was kind of like, okay, I have to go look at your information a little bit more. I don't want like some kind of U.S. Customs police showing up at my door like, hey,
right,
revealed classified information. But I have to decide whether this person is legit or not before I get into that.
Yeah. Customs backlash you don't need in your life.
Yeah, no. I'm like, do I really want to talk about customs?
Yeah, right. And how interesting. I guess they probably see some pretty weird stuff come and go. But yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you again, Melissa Martell. The podcast is Secret Door, and they can catch that weekly. Is that right?
Yeah, we usually do a show released idealistically on Friday. Sometimes it's Saturday morning, depending how busy I get. And I've been trying to do little news shows that I release throughout the week, but depending on my schedule as well, that are shorter little 10, 15-minute YouTube clips.
Right. Perfect. And the website is secretdoor.com or secretdoorpodcast.com.
Secretdoorpodcast.com, and everything's there.
Perfect. Melissa, thanks for talking to me, and go back to bed or get a cup of coffee and stay up with me, and we'll talk again.
Well, thank you for having me on. I will be going to get ready for work now.
Okay. All right. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
All right. The podcast again is the Secret Door Podcast with Melissa Martell and company. Check it out. All right. The 7th of March. You've been given the date. That's the next Podcastle Live. And wear the merch, buy the merch, win a wood watcher. And I will get that up on the website at strangebrowradio.com so you can see what a wood watcher actually is. Like I said, I usually sell out of them. They retail for about $200. I spend a lot of time on honing in just the right face on a slab of cedar or Doug fir, honed from the Almoon Altar or Harstein Island here in the Olympic Peninsula. So you want to check that out. You can find those also attached to my name, and if you go on Facebook, you can find my Facebook page, Woodwatcher, associated with that, and I have a few up there that you can take a look at as well. And as always, if you have a strange encounter with the supernatural, a cryptid, anything outside the ordinary, I'd love to talk to you myself. And the best way to do that, even anonymously, is strangebrowradio@gmail.com. No story too weird. Well, I guess I should be careful what I wish for with that one. All right, thanks again for listening. And as always, I will see you in the trees.